Hey guys, it's Gary. I'm back with new haircut. I gave you guys a couple days off, feeling sorry for you because I'm filming far too many videos that are far too long for people to take, really. But I did give you 2 days off, which probably you didn't even notice. And I've been doing a little hunting through my archives, but my various storage bins, looking for things that have been missing that I want to do videos about. And invariably, I keep finding things that I wish I had included in previous videos. I found several Terry Riley discs that I would have loved to have shown in my Terry Riley thing, and a disc by Dave Friedman, the vibraphone player. That's a really good quartet date that I completely forgot that I even had. And it would have been great to show that during my Double Image video, because that was a band that he was one of the leaders of. And I was showing some solo discs by the primary members of Double Image, and I only had one Dave Friedman disc, and it turned out to show, and I didn't even realize I had a second one, a really good quartet date. So I don't know. One of these days I might do a video of filling in the gaps. I don't know if I should really bother or not. Today I've been putting this one off because I haven't found the discs. But I'm missing a couple LPs, but I found all of the CDs that I wanted to find. And as a matter of fact, very quietly in the background, you probably can't hear, I'm actually playing one of them. I'm always a little paranoid about the copyright thing. But the disc that I'm playing is a date from 1969 by today's subject, Don Cherry. And it was originally recorded for a French label, Big BYG. And I think it's probably pretty safe that either you can't hear it or that it's not going to be picked up by copyright. I would have probably played maybe an ECM disc, but don't think I'd stand a chance there of those getting... I've seen a few of those get pulled, I think. So where did I discover Don Cherry, and what does Steve Hillage have to do with it? Well, in 1977, Steve Hillage came out with this, well, I think is probably still his best album to this day, at least in the prog rock genre. I was very much into prog rock, and this was Steve Hillage's second album overall. Has a 76 date on it. But I think it came out early 77. And I actually went to see him. I was in my last year of high school. And I went to see him because he had, for his second album, signed to Atlantic Records in the U.S. And his first album wasn't even available in the U.S. He could buy it as an import, but he didn't have a regular record label. And I guess Atlantic decided to give him a shot, gave him 2 albums shot. He didn't sell 1 million copies, so they dumped him. And from that point on, all his records you pretty much had to get by imports. But I wasn't into jazz yet, and I wasn't really ready for anything else. I wasn't even into Klaus Schulze. I haven't even gotten that far yet. But I was kind of scouring through prog rock, looking for things that interested me, and kind of went through that fairly quickly in like a year or two. I was kind of exhausted and like not finding anything that was pushing the limits maybe as far as I wanted to. And I think I had read possibly a review of this album before it came out, just called L, the letter L. And it's a very good prog rock album. There's 2 covers on here, a George Harrison song and a Donovan song, Hurdy Gurdy Man. Those are the 2 least interesting things on the album. There's 4 other pieces that were written by Steve Hillage. This is a very good album. This I could still listen to this day. Though oddly enough, the covers, the George Harrison song and the Donovan song, to me are the hardest to get through because they're the most mainstream pop. There's a lot of instrumental on this album. And at the time I was heavily into Todd Rundgren's Utopia, who put out a couple really good prog albums, especially their first album. And since the entire Utopia band was backing him up, and I had probably read about it, but I was such a Utopia nut, I probably picked it up just based on that alone. And really found that it's a really good prog album. It's one of those, that I could, for the most part, still listen to today. But there was one thing on here that stood out. You had basically Todd Rundgren's backing band, which at this point was 3 people. And the only additional musicians were Steve Hillage's wife or girlfriend, just still together, still making music together, Muquette Girardi, who does mainly voices on this, some female voice on this. Later on, she went to play a lot of synthesizer on Steve's albums. Larry Karush, who's a tabla player, who I would kind of rediscover many years later because he played in a band with Glenn Moore, the bass player from the band Oregon. And so Larry Karush was associated with a group of musicians unknown to me that I would later be very, very much into. And I completely forgot he even played on this. Very interesting, because how seriously I got into him many, many years later. And the only other musician on here is Don Cherry. Don Cherry on here plays trumpet, Tibetan bells, tambora, and voice. Don't really hear the voice. You can't tell. There's a lot of different bells and chimes on here, which could be coming from any number of people, including Steve Hillage and his girlfriend plays them. But the trumpet is obviously a standout because there's no one else playing trumpet on this album. And the weird thing is I wish you could hear it. This example of trumpet, and I would play it, but I don't know what would happen, because it is so. What can I say? It's there's one trumpet solo in this whole album. That's all there is, and it lasts for a minute and a half to 2 minutes, and during that period, it takes the album into someplace completely different. That it creates its own little musical world that's totally unlike anything else on the album. Like all of a sudden, the album is elevated to something else. And there's good music before and after it, too. But there's something else when this trumpet comes in. And there's basically a fairly laid-back rhythm section. So there's bass and drums going on. But there's this big blanket of synthesizers, blanketing most of the sound, taking up most of the sound field. And the trumpet plays over that. And I've never heard Don Cherry in this context again. I've never heard him play with synthesizers quite like this in this manner again. And indeed, he played rarely with synthesizers anyway, but even when he did, they were much more conventional. But it's really beautiful. It's almost worth buying the album for that 2-minute solo spot. But the weird thing is if you played this for anybody that knows anything about music, or somebody, and you ask them to maybe transcribe the solo or something, or say, what's he playing here? I don't think there's a correct note on this, and that whole 2 minutes that he plays on this, he's just playing these wild runs. And if you listen closely, you could tell, by what the chords that the synthesizers are playing, what the bass is playing, that it's not actually in the same key. Actually, the key appears to be changing too as these chords progress and as the solo goes on. And Cherry's just doing these weird sounds and these weird runs, and it's. I don't think there's a single note that's in the correct key in the whole thing. And if you played this for somebody that was really just a professional musician or something like that, and they weren't listening to the feeling of it, they would just say, "Oh my God, that's horrible! That's everything on there is wrong." And it is, but it's so beautiful. It's one of those things that just transcend the fact that yes, all the notes are wrong, but there's this vibe and this feeling. And sometimes he's doing this really fast run of notes, and then sometimes he'll just hold out a single note. And it's unlike anything else. It's the only, the weird thing is it was the only small section of the record that I couldn't quite wrap myself around and quite get. I was listening for mostly guitar solos and synthesizer, blah, blah, blah. But then, because that was the one thing that was a little, perhaps, hard to grasp, I really honed in and started really paying attention to it to try to get it, because it really didn't sound like he was playing notes that matched the chords. And by paying attention to it, it soon got to the point that I would anticipate the solo coming in, and it doesn't really, you could say it clashes, but instead of clashing in a negative way, it actually creates its own little vibe. It's really beautiful. And it got to the point that in a very short amount of time, maybe a couple months or something like that, listening to this, that became the moment that I most anticipated on the record, and do to this day. But even back then, I could tell, wow, that's really just, it's so out there, but it fits what's going on musically. In terms of the vibe and the atmosphere, it doesn't come in and destroy it like some free jazz. If somebody came in and honking and squealing away during this relatively mellow moment, it would ruin it. But although the notes don't match, the vibe matches. It's very hard to explain, and it got to be my favorite moment on the record. And now, like, the one thing that I'll still listen to. I'll listen to the whole track, and just the way that it goes into that solo, it's really something to this day. And it made me a Don Cherry fan for life. Don Cherry is probably my favorite trumpet player in the whole world. Even with his faults, call them, I didn't really know where to go, and I started picking up some albums of his. And to be honest, I can't recall what the first ones were that I picked up by him. I never really found anything that matched that solo on the Steve Hillage thing, only because he didn't really play much with synthesizers, and it was a very interesting contrast to have that soft electronic sound and have the very real, very breathy acoustic sound of the trumpet over that. Just a fantastic moment, which I would play now if I thought I'd get away with it. So where did I go? Well, I'm not 100% sure where I went and what I got next by him. So I'm going to show you a bunch of records that I do have, and probably give you a warning about some things maybe to stay away from, like I always like to do. I don't have my vinyl on this, but I did buy in 1969. Don Cherry is a very political person. And in 1969, you had the Nixon presidency, which he was very much protesting and very much against. And he ended up leaving the USA for a number of years and living overseas, I think in Sweden. I know he lived in Europe. He became a world traveler. And that probably affected him musically. And he went all over the place and started getting into more native folk music. See, Don had already, and for some people is best known for playing with Ornette Coleman. And that was purely as a trumpet player. So when he's playing with Ornette Coleman, there's a lot of trumpet that he's playing there. After that, he became part of the free jazz movement, which was, the pretty wild free form stuff, which he was pretty much doing when he decided to leave America. But when he went overseas, not that he wasn't doing free jazz anymore, but he started toning it down a bit and stripping his music maybe even down to more basics, and getting into more indigenous and folk music and stuff that would be now called world music, but it wasn't called world music then. And so his music changed. And one of the things he recorded while leaving our country was a duet session with the drummer Ed Blackwell, who was a longtime music partner. They had played together in Ornette Coleman's band, and throughout the years they just always got together. I don't even know that there was any extended breaks where these two guys did not play together. Later on, in the late 70s, they even formed a band together made up of Ornette Coleman alumni. And he did a duet session. I'm a sucker for duet and solo albums, which I had on 2 vinyl discs called MU Part 1 and 2. This is not the original album cover, but first album was about a 36 minute album, which was Part 1, and Part 2 was about a 30-minute album, which came out, I think, a few years later. But both albums were actually recorded in the same session in France on August 22nd of 1969. And it was one of the early examples, I believe, of Don really getting into world music. And he started doing things like vocal chanting, playing a lot of wood flutes that he had picked up along the way, his pocket trumpet, which he's very famous for, a kind of small portable trumpet that to me sounds like a it has a little bit of a higher tone than a regular trumpet, but it's not real noticeable. He started picking up Indian flutes, bamboo flutes, and started playing some bells and percussion, as well as piano, which on his solo albums he always played a lot of piano. But this new Part 1 and 2, the entire 2-record set, was basically, like I said, it's about 68 minutes, was recorded in a single day, August 22nd, 1969. Live, no overdubbing. So it doesn't sound like a band because it's just Ed Blackwell on drums and percussion and Don playing piano and voice and flutes and trumpet. An interesting album. And it's one thing I didn't find. I kind of given up looking for it. Is my the two I had bought each vinyl separately. They came out as 2 separate editions, Part 1 and Part 2, which I had on vinyl. May have been my first purchase of his solo stuff. I'm not sure because I did have them on vinyl. The only problem with them, I really like these albums, but the Mew albums, but they're not recorded very well. I'd say what it basically sounds like. They were recorded in a professional studio. Compared to some other Don Cherry recordings, they sound good, but he's got some rough recordings out there. But at the time, 69, was not a great time for engineering records so much. And I don't know this French studio that they used, how big and sophisticated they were. A lot of the music is very dry sounding. There's no reverb on there or anything. And the drum kit tends to sound a little small, which when you've only got 2 musicians and when I'm playing a drum kit is kind of a mistake. My first impression was that it sounds horrible. It sounds like somebody just hung like a microphone on one end of the room and a second microphone on the other end of the room and just recorded whatever was in the air, which you lose the depth of the instruments and the bass end of the drums and the toms and stuff like that. But, in the last couple of days I've been revisiting these, which is why I haven't done a video, as a matter of fact, because I've been playing so many of these albums to get familiar with them again. And they're not recorded as poorly as my memory seems to retain of them. Maybe, and I'm sure that's because I was going in with the lesser expectations, the expectations that these things sound horrible. And they don't. It sounds maybe too clean, that it needs a little bit of a reverb or something like that. And I can recall on my stereo, when I play the disc on my stereo, I have this kind of rule. I always listen to the music flat because some of the stereos have room enhancement things where you can they add reverb, like a small hall will be a little bit of reverb. If you hit another button, you get a little bit more reverb, like a big hall and a cavernous hall and stuff like that. And there's a lot of EQ things that you can play around with. But I always listen to my music completely flat because I'm trying to get as close to what was engineered and what the engineers meant to be heard, and that's kind of the flat response, and turn up the volume if you need it, but not to play around and add reverb where it wasn't there. And I gotta admit, this is the one album that I used to put, the only album ever that I used to put reverb on my stereo. It has a button for a little reverb to add a little ambiance to it, and it actually did sound better that way. Only album I've ever done that with. So now I've revisited these. Like I said, I had the album, the original album, which had a different cover, despite the fact that I can't find my vinyl, you're not missing much because the original vinyl was just a plain black cover that said MU Part 1 or MU Part 2 on it. The nice thing, though, is when it did come out on disc, because it's only 68 minutes, they included the whole thing, both Part 1 and 2, on a single disc. A couple years ago, it got reissued on disc, and I bought it again, same thing, the complete set, and hoping that the sound would be a little better. And I didn't actually play this one. I didn't do a side-by-side comparison. And maybe the reason, when did this come out? This came out, was reissued in 2001 again. And there's a claim that it got remastered. And it may have, because this is the disc that I played that made me think that, gee, that sounds better than I thought it did. And like I said, it could be just because my expectations were so low, or because they actually did remaster it and it sounds better. I'm not going to say it sounds great. It does sound better. I mean, you can only do so much with an original tape. if the tape's not recorded well. And there's no distortion on there or anything, but like I said, it's a little thin sounding. When you've only got two guys playing, there's no overdubs apparently, it's all live. So if you hear Don Cherry playing piano, Ed Blackwell's pretty much always playing drums, it's just piano and drums. If you hear Don Cherry playing flute, it's just flute and drums. So there's not a lot of instruments going on, and I'm fine with that, but you want the best recorded sound. And I'll tell you this, playing it back now, and this is the edition I played, the newest edition, which was remastered, it does sound better. And if I ever found my vinyl, probably even played this back. This was not remastered when this came out. The previous CD edition on Affinity Records, this was an import, Charlie Records. So probably even if I played this, maybe I would notice the difference. But it's better sounding than I recall, and it got a nicer cover this time. Never had a great cover. The first cover was pretty much all black from what I remembered on the vinyl. This is an okay pick of Don Cherry blowing. Doesn't get much. Ed Blackwell doesn't get much credit, unfortunately, and it should be really Don Cherry and Ed Blackwell. Yeah, sure, Don wrote the music, but a lot of this is improvisation, and the late Ed Blackwell is not really getting the credit because musically he's carrying quite a lot himself. Good album. And I'm going to now that it doesn't sound as bad as I anticipated it being, I think I'm going to revisit it. And I have been playing it. I did play it yesterday. I'm actually playing it in the stereo now. It's in the background. And I like it, but it might be a little too basic and raw for folks, maybe. However, in 1982, in February, skipping ahead many years, because that was 1969, Don Cherry and Ed Blackwell got together again just for a duo session. This is the first time they've done it since 1969. They played together on and off in many incarnations over the years. But they actually, for ECM, recorded this album in February of 1982, just the two of them. And you can see they both get equal credit on here. And it's very much the same thing. It's very much an updating of what they did in 1969 in France. And this time, Ed Blackwell's getting a little bit more credit. There's pieces that he is credited with writing on here in addition to Don Cherry. And they also do Bemsha Swing, which is a Thelonious Monk tune. So they even got a little more traditional and conservative, perhaps, on occasion on that album. But it's a lot of the same in terms of the approach. It's pretty much live. I don't record there being overdubs. There may be some subtle overdubs on this because this is just a single album and it's maybe 40 minutes or so, which I do have on CD as well. This is kind of, I wish that the Mew Part 1 and 2 had been engineered like this. Some nice pictures, if you could see them, of them in the studio together. Just Don and Ed Blackwell back in 1982. And Ed Blackwell, I don't think he was around much longer than that. I'm not sure. He was around for a while. But this is a good album. But again, it doesn't sound like a band. It's not supposed to sound like a band. Ed Blackwell playing drum kit on here again, and also some wood drum. And Don Cherry doing his pocket trumpet thing. He's playing piano. He's also playing a couple instruments that he wasn't playing in 1969. He's playing the melodica, which that little thing that you blow air into with the piano keys on it. He plays that a lot. And if that's poorly recorded, it really sounds cheap and cheesy. Thankfully, because ECM engineers are like the best engineers in the world, they know how to record it and to get a little bit more depth to the sound of the melodica, which Don plays. He also plays a tiny little bit of electric organ on this, which is very interesting to me because Don only very occasionally touched an electric keyboard, so it's there's unfortunately not much organ on here. I would have liked to have heard more. And he plays something called a dusunguni, which is kind of like an African guitar, but I only think it has a couple strings. It's not it's almost more like a bass guitar in that you tend to play riffs on it and not chords as much. So I don't think it has more than 2 or 3 strings. And it creates a nice rhythm groove. It's got a buzzy sound, so it almost sounds like an acoustic bass guitar would. If you've ever heard a bass guitar, the type that are just like acoustic guitars that you hold and play like a bass, not like an upright. You hold them like a guitar, I mean, not like an upright bass. And it's got a buzzy sound that kind of creates a nice groove. And Don was into that for pretty much when he got into it, probably the late 70s, early 80s. He pretty much played for the rest of his career. It's something that tends to create more of a groove than anything else. So it's almost like a bass guitar. At about the same time, I'm kind of going out of order here. But right now, this little focus session is probably the albums to buy from him. The El Corazon, which was the name of the ECM album that I just showed with Ed Blackwell. Don was part of a trio. Here's a great place to hear him too, called Codona. Not a band that he started. They only recorded 3 albums. There's Codona 1. Here is Codona 2. And here's Codona 3. And I don't have 2 on CD yet. And it looks like the only way I can now get Codona 2 on CD is to buy the entire 3 CD set, because they no longer sell them separately, like they did at one point. Codona was a great band that was actually started by the guy in the middle there, Colin Walcott, who is the percussionist, sitarist in the band Oregon. And Colin had, outside of Oregon, all 4 guys of Oregon started recording solo albums, as did Colin. But after doing a couple solo albums, Colin kind of felt that he didn't so much like being a solo artist. So what he did is he decided to form another band. So in addition to Oregon, instead of going off and doing a solo album during Oregon's downtime, he decided to create another band. So he created this trio, and he had Don Cherry and Nana Vasconcelos, who was the percussionist in Codona, on a prior solo album of his. And I guess he liked the combination, and Colin Walcott was very much a guy that was already into world music and getting more into world music, and kind of came up with this idea, what would it sound like with Colin Walcott's percussion and sitar, and Nana Vasconcelos, who's a percussionist who plays berimbau and some very interesting, odd percussion things, and does some very interesting, unusual voice things as well, and Don Cherry, who's playing trumpet and could play piano, and his flutes and that dusunguni, that African guitar thing, and also liked to do things with his voice. And they formed this band, and it was primarily acoustic instruments. There's again on the 3rd album, Don Cherry plays a little bit of organ, and the first album was entirely acoustic, and so is the 2nd album. It looks like, with Don Cherry also playing melodica again, in addition to the trumpet. A little bit of organ on the 3rd album, not much. Again, I would like to have heard more, played by Don Cherry. But in an interview, this band made 3 albums, and they probably would have kept going. But unfortunately, Colin Walcott died in 1984, and the band started recording in 78, and the 3rd album came out in 82. And Colin Walcott died. Don Cherry, afterwards in an interview I had read, pretty much gave credit, saying, it was really Colin's idea to form that band and get it together. It was seen as 3 equal members with equal say in everything, but it was Colin that was a driving force of putting that band together. And it was a shame that they didn't continue, that there wasn't more, but unfortunately, and all these, you have to get these 3 albums together, though. Unfortunately, all 3 Codona albums are only available together, unless you can find like a used CD copy, which are out there, because they did come out individually, and then ECM packaged the 3 of them together, and now they're only available together. Colin Walcott died, though, in 1984 in a tour bus accident. He was touring, I believe it was in Germany, with the band Oregon. And he was on a tour bus with some of the other band members. And the driver of the bus and Colin Walcott were sitting in the front of the bus which was, I believe, driving through fog, some really bad fog, and they had an accident. And the tour bus driver, as well as Colin Walcott, died. The guys that were sitting in the front of the bus died. The two guys that were sitting in the back, two other members of Oregon, survived the accident because they were way back, I guess, way past the impact point. So with that, the Codona band broke up, which was really a shame because you heard quite a bit of Don Cherry's trumpet in there. And the kind of theme that we'll be getting into is that there's a lot of Don Cherry albums, and primarily people, including myself, listen to Don Cherry to hear his trumpet playing. And yet he's recorded a lot of albums with very minimal trumpet playing. The Codona was a good place. He did a lot of other things. He did a lot of vocal chants. He did some piano playing. He played some organ. He played the melodica. He played some wood flutes in Codona. But there was a bit more trumpet there too. And just the contribution of the other two members and the fact that all three Codona albums are very well recorded really make it a good point to hear him. And because it's a small band too. You see later on there's some large band projects that even though they're well recorded, Don Cherry's just hidden in the mists of all these other musicians. So that El Corazon, good album to start with. If you could stand duets, this is well recorded and very much in print. Was the last time I checked, anyway. And if you don't like duets, maybe the Codona thing, because that might be a bit more of a band sound, I think, with three musicians going on and even some overdubbing, I think. And this is an interesting one, but man, is this out there. A duo album with a guy named John Appleton, and this was recorded, I don't know when. I should have checked, but I don't know how much my brain can retain. This was a nice thing. This was an album that was released, I want to say the late 60s or early 70s. And it looks like it's 1970. According to the liner notes, it looks like this was done in 1970, came out on record, and was out of print for many years, and the CD came out in 2007 or 2006. A guy named John Appleton, who was a very early synthesizer experimenter. This is at a time, when the only synthesizers were in places like Princeton and places like that, and synthesizers took up an entire floor of a building, and they were only monophonic and only got a single note at a time. And a lot of avant-garde music, some of which I've shown in the past, the early synthesizer experimenters, like Morton Subotnick and people like that. So apparently that's who this John Appleton was. And I don't know who got the idea to record with Don Cherry, but it's pretty out there, and it's not, when I said earlier that I like to hear Don Cherry with more synthesizers and electric keyboards, I meant in a more conventional sense. This is out there. The synthesizers are basically just making a lot of sounds, weird sounds, and Don Cherry is right there with the trumpet. He's making a bunch of weird sounds too. And the original album is, there's a couple bonus tracks that are like 2.5 minutes long that were added to the original album. But I tell you, this is so obscure. It's actually from a record company called Water, W-A-T-E-R, out of San Francisco. I've never heard of them before. They must be interested in pretty off-the-wall stuff, because I don't know how many copies of this they would have sold. But they re-released this in 2006. Probably came out, when it came out in around 1970 or 71, it probably went out of print very quickly. Very obscure, odd album. I like it. I really like it. But it's for those extremely adventurous types that can listen to guys like Derek Bailey and things like that. Pretty out there, but very interesting, and really the only album like it in Don Cherry's catalog. Just to show what a fanatic I got to be at one point over Don Cherry, is I just started picking up side albums, anything that he would pick up on a side album. This guy is essentially a guitarist, keyboard player, and I picked it up just because I thought there might be some of the Steve Hillage vibe on there. There really isn't, but it's not a bad album from what I remember. Don Cherry plays just trumpet on this, and there's a tabla player and a bass player. And the main guy, this Jai Uttal, appears to be primarily a guitarist, and he plays keyboards, he plays harmoniums, shakers, bells, things like that, gongs, and synthesizer on here. Not a bad album. Not a bad album. And I think, again, Don Cherry's appearances on there are kind of little guest shots here and there. I don't recall him playing a whole lot on that album. But got to be a big fan and started looking at anything that looked like an interesting music combination for him. Here's a guy I'd never heard of. This is actually an expensive Japanese import that I will pull out the obi. Hold on a second. So there's the obi. This is an interesting album. This is basically a live album, recorded live, in 1979. And it's the percussionist's album. He is the leader of this group. I'd never heard of him before. Masakiko Tagashi. And this is he's a percussionist, a drummer. And it's a trio with Don Cherry and Charlie Hayden on bass. What a great group. There's a picture in the back that I'm hoping you could kind of comes out. And it kind of makes me sad when I see this. I totally, if you didn't see the fact that the percussionist sits in a wheelchair, so apparently does not have the use of his legs, you would not know it to listen to this. There is so much percussion stuff going on when this guy plays. I don't know if he's got two other arms hidden behind there or what. This guy is really impressive. And when I did a search on Amazon, he's got a lot of albums out. This guy must have been playing for a very, 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 very long time. All of the albums are pretty much impossible to get. They're all Japanese imports. But he's apparently well known in Japan. I guess he doesn't travel out much, but he plays with a lot of big American jazz musician names. And actually, he wrote all the music on this album. This I'd recommend. If you ever come across this, I don't know if you get this at a reasonable price. I recommend this. The recording quality could be better, but what a band. You got Charlie Hayden on bass, and you got Don. And there's Charlie Hayden, is 79, looking very healthy. And when I look at this, I feel a little sad because, both Charlie has passed away recently, and Don's been gone now for a while. But Charlie looks particularly healthy there, as he did. When he was recorded in the late 70s, early 80s. I had seen Charlie Hayden, a month or two before he passed away, on television, on an interview on a weekend news program that played a segment. It had been pre-recorded, but it had been pre-recorded very recently. And they were interviewing Charlie, I guess about his career, and I missed part of it, unfortunately. And at the end of the interview, Charlie's bass was in the studio. And just as I went to commercial, I said, could you just play a little bit of bass as we're going to commercial after the interview was over? And Charlie's like, sure. And it was kind of sad because Charlie didn't look well at that point. He looked very frail. And when he went to stand up to go, a studio hand brought the bass over to where Charlie was sitting. And Charlie had to play in a standing position with the big upright bass. And Charlie needed help standing, and it was kind of sad because he had the studio hand was holding the bass for him, just waiting for Charlie to get up, and Charlie's getting up from the chair, but he's having difficulty standing up from the chair. And all he had to do was stand up from the chair, and the bass was right there, and grab onto the bass. And the studio hand kind of had to hold his arm and help him to the bass, even though the bass was right there. It was very sad. And it showed to me, gee, I guess, I hadn't really seen Charlie for years. And it was sad. And then it was maybe a month after that I heard that he passed away. So when I saw that picture again the other day, I just found these CDs 2 days ago in one of my boxes. I've been looking for my Don Cherry stuff, and I was pretty sure I'd kept them all together, and I had, but they were in one of the bins that was like the farthest off in the corner of the room, buried under two other bins, and it's like, I gotta find this stuff. And sure enough, I found it. But then, you get the memories back with it, too. Of course I bought this on CD. It's a great album! El Corazon. One of those along with Codona that I highly recommend. Now we're going to get to some Don Cherry stuff that might be best to avoid. And I'm glad Don's not around to see this video. When Don was, I mentioned Don leaving the U.S. around the time of the Nixon administration in the late 70s. and Don became a world traveler, and he started recording anywhere and everywhere. And there's this album recorded in this is I believe it's a German music festival, October 17th, 1971, by Don Cherry and Penderecki, and I want to say it's Christoph, or I forget the Penderecki's name. He's essentially, I guess, a composer, European serious music composer that at one point began recording, writing things for large scale jazz ensembles, and he wrote there's only 3 pieces on that album. It's not a very long album. And I can't find his first name. Christoph, starting with a K, but it's I could KRZYSZTOF. So your guess is as good as mine, folks. But there's an interview in the booklet with him, and this features Don Cherry primarily. Don Cherry's credited with writing 2 of the 3 pieces. And the third piece is a piece by Penderecki himself called Actions for Free Jazz Orchestra. It's an enormous band, and when I read the back of it the other day after finding this, I'm like, how come I don't remember this? It's all jazz giants, all European jazz giants. Manfred Scouf on trumpet and cornet, Kenny Wheeler on trumpet and cornet, Thomas Stanko on trumpet and cornet. These are all huge guys. Albert Mangelsdorf, trombone, German, very well-known jazz guy. Peter Brotzmann on saxophone. Günter Humpel, if you know who he is, a guy with many, many solo albums out, playing flute and bass clarinet on this. Terje Repdal on guitar. Peter Warren on bass and electric bass, the only American in the group. Peter Warren played with Jack DeJohnette's, one of Jack DeJohnette's bands for a while. Special edition. He played on their second album. Hans Bennick on drums, tabla, blah blah blah. And yet, with all those guys, it's not a very good album. The one piece that's written by Penderecki is the most together thing there. But it's such a big band. It's not really you don't really hear Don Cherry playing in the context of the band very much. There's so many horns and so much going on. And then there's a free jazz section, and the only bit of guitar you hear for maybe a minute sounds like Terje Repdal's tuning his guitar up. I mean, it's really there's this composed section, I guess, and there's this free section in this last piece, which is a 16.5-minute piece. And, I was listening for guitar. Oh, Terje Repdal's on guitar here. And I'm listening for it. But it sounds like Terry's falling down the stairs with his guitar in his hand, really. Unfortunately. And there's a middle song, which is basically consists of Don singing a chant by himself. And then talking to the audience for about 5 minutes. And the first track is a world music thing that's basically Don doing a chant, and again, not a lot of trumpet. There's more of him playing around with flute, but there's a woman called Lois McGillicuddy on vocal, who's singing basically what sounds like improvised yelling. It's I gotta be honest, it's really awful. And her microphone is turned up 10 times louder than the entire rest of the band. And this is a big band. There's like 20 people in the band. And you're just waiting for her to shut up because it's 19 minutes long. And you're waiting to hear Don play a solo or something else to go on besides this woman yelling. But this woman basically won't stop. I'll tell you what it sounds like. Forget about jazz orchestras. It sounds like a really bad hippie band when they were really stoned, inviting somebody who can't sing on stage to kind of yell along, is what it sounds like. So, and I got all excited when I saw who was on here. But then I played the music. So that, that's one of those things that, I don't even, I don't 100% know why it's credited to Don Cherry, even though that first piece, he's credited with writing the one, so I guess he kind of maybe wrote the basic riff of the song, which repeats while this woman yells over it. But I don't know that it's a lot more of a Don Cherry album than it is anybody else who plays on there. So not one to necessarily go look for. Unfortunately, it's such a fantastic band too. And now here's a couple others, not nearly as bad as that though. These are imports, a couple discs that came out at the same time. They were old albums that had been out of print for many, many years of Don Cherry's. I don't know what label they originally came out on. But in 2002, this label it must be Japan, because it's all Japanese writing on the gatefold inside. It's all Japanese. But in 2002, they reissued several albums of Don's that had apparently been out of print for many years. And one of them is called Blue Lake, which is this one here, and nice little cardboard booklet they put in here too. Here's the disc. I like that little cardboard booklet though. And the other one, these both came out in 2002, I believe, is called Orient. Also 2002 on the Fruit Tree label. And it looks like they, at least for this one here, they are using the original album cover, which is an ant on an egg yolk. And just in case you missed it, they put it on the back as well. And again, liner notes in Japanese, but at least in English on the other side. You get the listing of, unlike the other one that had nothing in English, at least you get a listing of the tracks. But I wish there could be a little more information. These are very, very, very small bands. And it looks like it's basically Don Cherry and one or two percussionists. I know Hans Bennick, who's a fairly well-known European percussionist, is the primary percussionist on this. But I'm also seeing a credit that looks like it's to other percussionists. Neither one of these are prime Don Cherrys. And the problem is they're both from the early 70s. And they're both live recordings, unfortunately not engineered great. And the problem with live performances, unless you've got a hall, like Carnegie or something like that, that is, or a club that's built for sound, it's built to sound good so you can record bands there. A concert, to be honest, is not the greatest place for sound quality, unfortunately. And the worst of them all are outdoor festivals where the sound is absolutely horrendous. And it's very hard to overcome that. And I think that at least both of these are live albums. Orient and Blue Lake from the early 70s, I believe, and probably about 71. And unfortunately, what are they marred by? Well, poor sound. They're both live. The Orient thing, it seems to be the only other musicians on here are percussionists. So you're getting nothing but percussion. And when Don Cherry occasionally will pick up a trumpet, which is all too rare on these albums, plays a lot of wood flute, and plays some piano too. But there's no other harmonic instruments going on when he's playing piano. But the problem is he does a lot of vocal chanting, and quite a bit of it is unfortunately out of key as well. Let me look at Blue Lake to see if there's a slightly larger band, but this is all in Japanese, and I don't see any. There's no breakdown of who plays on this. I think the Blue Lake album may be a slightly larger band, but it's a similar configuration. It's largely percussionists. And again, a poor quality live recording. And once again, Don doing a lot of vocal chanting, trying to get the audience to chant along with him. And it's one of those things where the voice is too loud, the vocalist is too high in the mix. He doesn't play a lot of trumpet. It doesn't sound great. It's not, it's very much something of its time. It's when I was listening to it, it kind of reminded me that it's more of a historical document. One of the things that Don does on one of these albums is, and I don't recall which one it is, but he gets into a very long tirade. Well, I say tirade because he starts talking politically. And obviously, it's dated. He's talking about some political things that were going on in the late 60s, early 70s. He talks about things like indigenous peoples' water being poisoned by, I guess industrialists and things like that. So it really if it didn't remind you of a history lesson up until that point, it all of a sudden became very much like a picture of what was going on. And I mean, if you're really going to do a career overview of Don Cherry, you have to be aware that he was very politically active. And I don't think any of these things are really intended to be albums, because I'm not sure that Don would have necessarily cut the political talk out, if he knew they were being recorded for albums. But he might have, and it's really, and the way it was recorded just leads you to think that, this happened to be something that was recorded live, and eventually they got the permission to put it out. Don signed off on it or whatever, and so they put it out. But it's very much, if you want to see what Don was thinking and what he was doing in the late 60s, early 70s, it's like if you became interested in Don musically enough to want to know about what his thoughts are and what his beliefs were and what his life was like, you would probably listen to these. They're almost more of a documentary than anything else. And I'm not necessarily sad I bought them. There is an interesting thing. If you did want to hear some samples of that stuff without going whole hog on them, I found this, Don Cherry Cool. It doesn't say anywhere that it's a compilation, but it is, and it doesn't give any credits. But what I did is I very quickly figured out that it's essentially a compilation, and I figured out from what albums they were from, and I kind of made my own notes. So it actually has a couple selections from Mew Part 1 and 2. Actually, 2 from the second album and 1 from the first album, even though Mew 1 and 2 were all from the same single-day session. So it's got a sample of those tracks, which are the best things on here. It's got about half of the Blue Lake album, the one I just showed, one of the live performances, and it's got about a third of the Orient album, which again, the same period live performances. So all these are late 60s, very early 70s stuff, and it's kind of it's not a real cheap budget thing, but if you wanted to, for whatever reason, sample those albums, especially the last 2 that I showed, without paying more for one of these, actually, because these are more expensive imports, you wanted to sample and find out what Don was up to, it's got half of the Blue Lake album, it's got a third of the Orient album, and if you're not sure about buying Mew Part 1 and 2, based on what I said earlier, because it wasn't recorded great, but the music's fine, you could also sample those here. So, but the liner notes are non-existent. They don't tell you who plays on the album. They don't tell you what albums they came from. I had to figure out just by listening. But I looked. I'm pretty sure this was still available and in print. So if you want to kind of sample that political era, that era that Don was living outside of the country, without going whole hog on all the albums, that's a good place. And believe it or not, and I found this amazing. I'd forgotten this. Don Cherry in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, actually had gotten a contract. This amazes me, with A&M Records. A&M Records? Are you kidding me? They're putting out, I don't know, the 80s MTV crap rock stuff, So it amazed me, that they had. I know Herb Alpert was part of A&M. But A&M had pretty much long gone to being strictly a pop music label, for the most part, and very rarely, they might have a sprinkling of jazz artists here and there, and yet Don recorded at least 2 albums for them. Amazing. Multiculti is the only one I have. I found that there was another one called Art Deco that came out just before this. I think Art Deco was 88. But because he's on a major label, there's a couple of guarantees. The sound was really good. Of course, the recording techniques in the late 80s, early 90s were a lot better. But they're also a lot more conservative albums. I don't have Art Deco, but looking at the tracks on Art Deco, he was doing some standards there, which is not something that Don did a lot of, especially late in his career. I kind of think he was maybe pushed in that direction a little bit. This is probably better than that, even though I haven't heard Art Deco, because there's more originals on here. The only problem was that it sounds slightly alien to me. Like it does. I guess I got so even though my first experience with Don was playing essentially with a progressive rock band, when I got into his stuff, I got very used to that acoustic environment that he operated in that was almost entirely acoustic instruments. The problem with Multiculti is there's like electric bass on here. It's a lot more short and groove oriented. There's things that are fairly short in length in terms of playing time. There's an enormous band, a huge band, and many times the band just is there and Don's not. It sounds like Don left the room and the band is doing its thing and they're playing their parts. It's not free jazz at all. I mean, it's all very well written out stuff with charts and everything. And there's plenty of time that's given to the other saxophone players in the band and whoever's playing. And there's pieces written by other members in this group, and it doesn't look like a group that Don necessarily put together. There's a couple things that Don does solo. He does a solo, very short piece, just for pocket trumpet. He does a solo for a Norwegian birchwood flute, and he does a couple things with a smaller band that does have synthesizers on it, but the synthesizers aren't really, I hate to say it, they're not used in a creative way. They're almost used in place of having like an orchestra or something like that. I actually, oddly enough, like the way they were used better on the Steve Hillage album. And it's weird because the first place I ever heard Don was amongst all these synthesizers, but when you hear them on this record, it just doesn't seem to fit his musical vibe. He does a melodica solo as well, one track with that. Interesting thing, though, one thing I wanted to mention, it appears not only on this album but others, that after Colin Walcott died in '84, hence the breakup of the Codona group, Don Cherry kept in contact with Nana Vasconcelos, the only other member of that group, and Nana plays on here as well as some other discs. So Don was apparently very happy with the Codona group, and like I said, I don't think that group would have split up. I think they would have continued to record had Colin Walcott lived, because Nana Vasconcelos has played, after that point, after Colin's death, continued to play with Don Cherry quite a bit. So, back to this, there's some nice little solo tracks on here, but they're all very short. And the problem is, those big band tracks, when the big band comes in and they let the saxophone player play, and things like that are going on, it's like Don's not even there. And essentially, I'm listening to this as a Don solo album, not as a band album. And there's parts written by Carlos Ward, who is one of the saxophone players on the album, Peter Applebaum, who is another saxophone player on the album, and on those pieces, it's Don's barely there, and that's at least three of the big, longer pieces on the album. There might be Don might be playing a little bit in there. He might maybe get a short solo in on the pocket trumpet, but for a lot of people, this would be a very accessible point of entry, because it's not avant-garde, it's not experimental, there's standard drum kit, there's a standard electric bass on some of these tracks, a standard configuration on how they play the music in terms of, they state a theme, they do an improv, somebody takes a solo kind of thing. But I don't know that it's a real good introduction to Don's musical world or his way of thinking. Though everything is recorded so well here, I'm almost tempted to say go get it. But I still think the Codona albums and that duet album, El Corazon with Ed Blackwell, might be a better place, because Codona is very much that musical world that he liked to live in. And one other thing, I completely forgot that I bought this. Weird, how it's like, how can I forget that? Here's an album by Don Cherry from the BBC. I'm like, what the hell does the BBC have to do with Don Cherry? And I always think of the BBC as being television. I don't think of the BBC as being radio, but they are radio. And I should know that because I hear the BBC News on the radio, and like every day. And at first, the album is just called Don Cherry. It doesn't really have a title, but there's a series, apparently, Jazz Legends, that you see it in the upper hand corner there. And I thought, I must have bought this. It must be a compilation or something, a late period compilation, because the album's date's a 2002 date. It's not a compilation, though. Oddly enough, this is a live concert recording from 1986. And the quality, the sound quality is fantastic on this. So apparently the BBC must have sponsored a series, a jazz concert series or something, that they then in turn recorded for their radio program and got the rights to release. I don't know where I learned about this. But it's very good. It's a very, it's probably the best live recording that I've heard of Don's music. And like I said, recorded in '86. It's got Don doing his trumpet. He does his vocal chants on this a little bit too, but it's a little more controlled than those early '70s albums. Plus, the recording quality is so much better. It's got Don's playing trumpet, the Dusunguni, the piano. He does some vocal stuff. He's got Carlos Ward on saxophone and flute, Carlos Ward was one of the guys in the Multiculti band. And he wrote some of the material on this album as well. Mark Callias on bass, which I believe I'm hearing electric, possibly end upright bass, both. And again, the electric bass, when I hear it, sounds a little foreign to me in terms of Don's music. It tends to be very repetitively rhythmic, and there's something more natural about. And I love electric instruments, but with Don's music, I really like that acoustic bass thing. And Mark Callias is just listed here on bass, but I can recall there's definitely things that I heard that sounded like an electric bass. But then later on, listening to the same concert, I thought I heard an acoustic bass as well. It's got Ed Blackwell on drums. Ed Blackwell, his old buddy, on drums in 1986. These guys stayed with him. Nana Vasconcelos, again from Codona, on percussion again, playing with him. So it's a band of, let's see, counting Don, 5 guys? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 guys. Nice band. Ed Blackwell and Nana Vasconcelos, two people that he played with for many years. And a bass player and saxophone player. It's a good album. Like I said, it's a little odd for me maybe to hear the electric bass in the context, and I would maybe have liked there to be a keyboard player there or something. Don just played piano, but 1986, the BBC engineers must have recorded this. Fantastic recording quality. I have no recollection of buying this. I only recognized the cover when I dug it out again, and I'm like, that's weird. It was weird. It wasn't loaded into my computer or anything. And yet it's pretty good. It's a pretty good small group thing for a live concert. It sounds fantastic. So that's it. I kind of dreaded doing this one in a way, because I knew I was going to be very long, and this is now officially my longest video ever to date. And I kind of knew it would be long because I knew I had a lot of stuff by him, and it's also me not recording for the last couple of days because I've been listening to this stuff. Okay, guys, I appreciate you watching. And I won't keep you longer. I was going to say a couple more things, but I'll save that for the next video. So I hope there's some value here for you guys, and thanks so much for all the guys that spend a lot of time watching my videos and commenting and stuff. And I hope you're having a great weekend or week or whenever you're watching this, and I'll be back soon.